The man was sitting alone in a room watching a video. Just as the suspenseful moment arrived, the screen flickered and then distorted completely. Among the black and white static, something white and blurry appeared. Suddenly, a ghastly face with two pitch-black eye sockets emerged, seemingly lunging towards the viewer. The man startled in fear and fell backward. He ran out into a desolate forest, his face still in shock, holding his phone up, trying to get a signal to call someone. Fortunately, his friend answered, expressing concern because he had been missing for several days. A few days earlier, Dan was restoring a horror film when a colleague visited him. She marveled at Dan's professional repair skills, noting that there was no broken videotape he couldn't fix. After finishing work at the archive, Dan received an enticing offer from Virgil, the president of a company called LMG. He wanted Dan to restore a series of tapes that had been severely damaged in the Visser apartment fire in 1994. Knowing that Dan had lost a family member in a fire, he used this shared experience to convince Dan to take on the project. At the same time, the payment offered was quite generous. However, Dan felt uncomfortable recalling the past and declined the invitation. Still, he took the sample tape that Virgil had given him and returned home. That night, Dan dreamed a nightmare about the fire that had killed his family. The dream was so haunting that he woke up in the middle of the night and decided to play the tape that Virgil had provided. In the tape, a girl named Melody Pendress appeared, a student working on a project about anthropology. She filmed her journey, preparing to interview the residents of the Visser building. Dan watched the beginning of the tape repeatedly and noticed something unusual. The dog in the footage resembled Dan's own dog, and he was certain he wasn't mistaken. The collar the dog was wearing was the very one Dan had saved up for 3 weeks to buy. Intrigued by the tapes, Dan accepted Virgil's offer. Virgil then drove to pick Dan up and take him to a secluded facility to work. Due to legal issues, they needed to keep everything in the tape confidential, so Dan couldn't work anywhere else but here. On the other hand, Virgil had prepared all the necessary supplies for Dan to live comfortably. He even arranged a health monitoring device for Dan. After Virgil left, immediately dove into his work. Soon after, he restored the first tape and opened it to continue watching. This seemed to be the next part of Melody's footage. She went to the Visser building to start her project. When Melody arrived, she met a man with an unpleasant face who opened the door. Since she needed to stay there for a while, she asked John for advice on how to get to know the residents. He only said one thing: to stay away from the 6th floor. That night, while Melody was asleep, she woke up to a strange noise. She went to the vent, opened a small door beneath it, and pointed her camera inside, but she didn't see anything at all. The next morning, Melody knocked on each door in the building to introduce herself and interview the residents, but strangely, no one opened their doors. Fortunately, Melody later encountered a clever little girl named Jess standing in the hallway. Jess often helped the residents with small tasks, so she knew most of the people living there. Melody paid Jess $25 a week to guide her in getting to know everyone. The first place Jess took Melody to was the home of Tamara, a musician who had lived there for 6 years. Tamara played a piece of music she composed for Melody, and the lyrics and melody were very haunting and eerie. Melody had only listened for a short while, but already felt dizzy and uncomfortable. Jess had to help her back to her room. At this point, Dan took out his phone to call Mark, his close friend who was a sound editor interested in supernatural phenomena. Although the place had enough amenities, it lacked internet, so Dan wanted Mark to investigate Tamara for him. However, the phone signal was unstable, and while Dan was leaving a message for Mark, the connection dropped. The next day, Dan continued watching the tape. This scene showed Jess and Melody talking to each other. The girl spoke about how she was born and raised in the building. Suddenly, Jess asked why Melody wanted to learn about the place. Melody replied that she was just curious why the residents chose to live at Visser. Jess vaguely said that they were drawn to something here. When Melody pressed for details, asking what it was, Jess countered with a question. "Didn't Samuel tell you?" Melody replied no, and suddenly Jess didn't want to continue talking. Her eyes fixated on something else, and her face showed fear. Jess slowly pushed her chair back as if something was rushing toward her. But before Jess could do anything, her body stood upright, her neck lifted high, as if someone were grabbing her. Then Jess fell down and started convulsing, causing Melody to panic and scream for help. After that, the tape malfunctioned, so Dan called Mark to ask if he had found any information about Tamara. Mark replied that there was no musician or artist by that name. At this point, Dan felt a strange sense of doubt. He told his friend to help him find all the information about the LMG company and the girl named Melody. Dan intended to share his recent experience with Mark, but decided against it. Before leaving, Dan marked the tape with a piece of string and left without noticing a figure in red watching him from a distance. Upon returning to his workspace, Dan continued to watch the tape, which had stabilized and resumed with Jess and Melody talking. Melody suggested that Jess might be ill, but the doctor had diagnosed her as perfectly fine. Jess then asked Melody if she believed in another world that existed, one that was identical to theirs but entirely different. Melody didn't believe this, which disappointed Jess. Just as the girl was about to say something else to Melody, the camera abruptly cut to a different scene. Melody was frantically searching for Jess, repeatedly saying that someone had kidnapped her. She ran everywhere looking for Jess, while John chased after her, continuously reassuring her that it was safe here. However, Melody didn't trust him, and everything turned out just as she feared. A group of people appeared, surrounding her. In the end, she managed to send a message asking to please find and save her. After watching the tape, Dan recalled that his father had been at this place when he was alive. He wasn't sure if his father was connected to the strange things he was experiencing. He asked Mark to find his family's records to see what he could uncover. Dan then continued his work, and the next tape began with Jess doing errands for the residents. There was a woman named Beatrice who was quite friendly and agreed to let Melody interview her. Beatrice had the ability to read tarot cards, so she decided to do a reading for Melody using 3 cards. First, she mentioned that Melody's past had been filled with pain, which was true. Secondly, she revealed that Melody hadn't come to this place by coincidence. Someone had guided her here. Just as Beatrice said, Melody was looking for a missing historian, and this was the last known location of that person. According to Beatrice, there was a room on the 4th floor that had been rented a long time ago, but no one had ever seen the owner. The letters for that room always overflowed from the mailbox, and she suggested that Melody could check it out. After saying this, Beatrice flipped over the 3rd card, and her expression suddenly turned to one of fear, for the meaning of this card was death. However, she reassured Melody that sometimes the death card didn't necessarily hold such a meaning. Melody didn't dwell on it and went to the mailbox anyway. Indeed, letters overflowed from the mailbox just as Beatrice had described. When Melody reached to pull one out, a man approached her. His name was Samuel, person Jess had mentioned before. He joked that stealing mail would cost $2,000. He then invited Melody to Tamara's musical performance, admitting that it was quite boring, but he felt obligated to attend for the sake of friendship. Melody found his enthusiasm endearing and agreed to go. That evening, she tried on several outfits. Suddenly, she received a message from Dr. Tuner. This detail confirmed to Dan that his father was indeed connected to this sinister place. He stepped outside to call Mark, telling him everything was just as he had suspected and asking his friend to continue investigating. After sending the message, Dan accidentally spotted the figure in red from before. He immediately chased after them, but when he reached the fence separating the work area from the outside, the person had vanished without a trace. Dan called Virgil's company to report it, but they dismissed his concerns, suggesting he might have psychological issues. Later that night, while watching a cartoon, Dan caught a glimpse of the figure in red reflected in the glass. Looking closely, he realized it was his father. He chased after him down a hallway, but by the time he reached it, his father had disappeared. Dan then noticed another shadow moving past, wondering if anyone else was there besides him. Dan followed and saw them enter a room. Gathering all his courage, he knocked on the door, but when the person opened it, Dan woke up, realizing it had all been a dream. He returned to his work, and the footage resumed with Melody attending Tamara's performance. Sitting next to her was Samuel. The opera had something strange about it that made Melody feel very uncomfortable, and she nearly fainted. Luckily, Samuel helped her to a quieter place to talk. Noticing that Melody wasn't feeling well, he decided to take her home. Before they left, Samuel handed her a master key, allowing her to open the mailbox without worry. Overjoyed, Melody gave him a quick kiss. After this kiss, Samuel decided not to go home but to buy some wine instead. Seizing the moment, Melody went to open the mailbox, only to find it completely empty. At that moment, Jess arrived and informed Melody that someone was looking for her. This person had been going door to door, bothering everyone and causing quite a stir. Melody immediately recognized that it was Annabelle, and not just anyone. Melody returned to find Annabelle waiting for her. Annabelle teased her relentlessly, leaving Melody at a loss for words. She even hinted that Melody might be avoiding Dr. Tuner because the two of them had slept together. Just then, Samuel arrived, providing a convenient excuse for Annabelle to leave. Dan paused the tape at this moment to grab something to eat. While at the food shelf, he felt something was off. It seemed there was a hidden space behind it. To confirm his suspicion, Dan broke through the wall, revealing a concealed hallway that led to strange rooms. However, he couldn't open any of the doors until he reached the last one at the end of the hallway. Entering, he found an empty room with no one inside, except for a Christian ritual book. As he pondered its purpose, Virgil suddenly appeared, visibly annoyed. He demanded that Dan give him a reason not to kick him out. Dan argued that their meeting wasn't coincidental, and that their connection was Tuner. If Virgil expelled him, he would miss out on crucial information. Virgil, feeling helpless, explained that this place had once conducted genetic research. When the operation was running smoothly, the government unexpectedly demanded access to the data. Faced with this unreasonable request, Virgil decided to disband the company and share no information. However, he still had questions that only Tuner could answer. Since Tuner had passed away and the tape containing relevant information was damaged, Dan was now the only one who could help him. After explaining everything, Virgil reminded Dan that if he ever came down here on his own again, he would no longer be lenient. Dan had no choice but to go back and continue his work. That night, while Melody was sleeping, she heard a strange noise coming from the air vent. She tried to wake her friend, but Annabelle was fast asleep. With no other option, Melody decided to go find the source of the sound on her own. She stopped in front of the community room and opened the door. Inside, there were two more doors. One of them was slightly ajar. Melody looked inside and saw a scene that startled her. People were sitting and praying in front of a statue. They were singing a very strange song, and it was clear that it wasn't something good. After a while, their bodies started twitching, and their mouths let out choking sounds. They kept doing that for a while, and then returned to normal. That was when the ritual ended. Melody hid to the side, and when the room was empty, she tried to sneak in to get a better look at the statue they had been praying to. But just then, someone entered the room. It was none other than Tamara and Samuel. The two of them began passionately embracing each other right there. Melody didn't understand why they were doing that. When Dan watched the tape up to this point, it suddenly emitted an extremely unpleasant sound. After witnessing what had just happened, Melody went back and told Annabelle. Annabelle wanted Melody to leave, but Melody refused. She said that she came here not only to work on her PhD thesis, but also to look for her mother. The woman who raised her was only her adoptive mother. Julia was actually the one who gave birth to her, and Melody wanted to know why she had been abandoned. While the two of them were talking, there was a knock at the door. Melody called out, but no one answered. She went out to check, but saw no one. This reminded Dan of his dream. After watching the most recent tape, Dan rode his bike to meet Mark. He asked his friend to look into the song that people who looked like members of a cult had been singing. Dan felt it was very similar to a piece of music his sister used to play when they were young. At that time, his father, Tuner, had a strong reaction upon hearing the song and forbade his sister from playing it again. As for Mark, he said he hadn't been able to find Melody's medical records, but Tuner had a habit of recording his patients' therapy sessions. Mark gave Dan all the recordings he had managed to find. The two of them spent a long time trying to figure out connection between Tuner and Melody. Mark suggested that Dan ask Melody directly because she hadn't died in the fire that year. She was still alive. Mark had even found Melody's address, but Dan probably wouldn't be able to go until the project was finished. Afterward, Dan went home and listened to the recordings that Mark had retrieved. From these tapes, Dan began to understand more about Melody's life. Turned out that she had been left at a church when she was only 2 months old. Since she was young, Melody had always felt that the world around her was strange. Similar to Jess, she could see a parallel world, but whenever she came into contact with it, Melody would lose control of her thoughts and actions. The nuns at the church had tried to help her with the problem, but nothing worked. The strange occurrences that Melody experienced only disappeared when her foster mother came to take her home. She thought everything was finally fine until her foster mother passed away. The same feeling from years ago returned once more, and that was what led Melody to seek help from Tuner, a psychologist. He admitted that he didn't yet know how to solve the case, but as long as Melody was willing, he promised to do everything he could to treat her. During the therapy sessions, Tuner brought out his friendly dog to help patients relax. By that time, Dan had come to understand more about the relationship between his father and Melody. The next thing he did was break into the house's surveillance system. Virgil had installed cameras everywhere to monitor Dan. He found a blind spot in the camera system and began to act in secret. But during the process, a woman named Bobby showed up because the water room had been running for too long. Dan was almost caught. He continued working on restoring the tape. That evening, Annabelle went with Melody to the community room to investigate, but they ended up with no useful clues. The box containing the statue had also disappeared. Melody didn't know where to start in her investigation of the group of people. She decided to go to Jess's room to ask for some information. The girl opened the door with an irritated look on her face. When Melody asked, she found out that Jess had just been in a fight with a friend. The reason was that Jess's friends kept teasing her because of the strange phenomena happening around her. Every time it happened, Jess's mother would call the priest to come and preach about faith, which exhausted Jess. Melody understood that feeling. It was exactly how she had felt when she was a child. So she took Jess to see Tuner, hoping he could help the girl the way he had helped her. But what Jess was experiencing seemed to be spiritual in nature, something a psychologist therapist couldn't really resolve. While Tuner was explaining Jess's condition to Melody, Jess's mother suddenly arrived and caused a commotion. It was probably a natural reaction. After all, a stranger had taken her daughter to see a doctor. Meanwhile, in real life, Mark had come to Melody's house. He asked her about several things, but it seemed she had lost her memory after the fire all those years ago. Whatever Mark asked, Melody answered vaguely and unclearly. With nothing useful gained, Mark had no choice but to leave. Back with Dan, he was still working on repairing and watching the footage. After taking Jess to the doctor, Melody went to visit Father Russo's church. The two had a fairly good conversation. Melody thought he was different from the priests she had met before. At that moment, they heard a scream outside. Jess was having a seizure. Russo immediately went over and began praying. In just a short time, Jess's condition stabilized. Whether she wanted to believe it or not, Melody couldn't deny what she saw. That night, she wanted to buy a small gift for Jess to cheer her up. While talking with Annabelle, Melody said something that caught Dan completely off guard. It was a feature, not a bug. Dan was stunned when he heard it, because he had once dreamed of Melody feeling sad for not being able to help anyone. In that dream, he had comforted her using that exact phrase. After finishing her shopping, Melody went up to Jess's room. From outside, she heard chaotic screaming. Worried that something had happened to the girl, she immediately broke the door down. Inside, Russo was performing an exorcism on Jess, but the girl appeared to be in extreme pain. Melody rushed forward to stop him, but Russo continued with the ritual. It wasn't until Samuel and John showed up that Russo finally left. Melody was devastated and furious at what she had just witnessed. However, Russo didn't offer any explanation. He only warned her firmly that she needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Otherwise, she would never imagine the things that might happen to her. That was where the footage ended. Despite it being nighttime, Dan went outside and called Mark. He wanted to ask about Melody, but the information he received left him deeply disappointed. The woman named Melody wasn't the real Melody. She had bought the real Melody's identity and used the victim's background to claim benefits. The real Melody was likely dead, because if she were alive, no one would be able to impersonate her so easily. Dan was in shock after hearing this. He asked Mark to do everything he could to find the real Melody, whether she was dead or alive. After the call, Dan returned to reviewing the footage, replaying the moment where Melody said that one unforgettable phrase. Dan rewound and replayed the footage over and over. Suddenly, Melody looked straight at the camera and said, "Hello, you've arrived." She held up a can of soda, offering it to Dan as if it were their first meeting. He stared in disbelief, wondering if this could be real. Melody in the video responded, "Of course it was." It seemed as though Melody had crossed into a parallel world, or perhaps even the future, to meet Dan. While the two were talking, something happened to Annabelle, and Melody had to run out. At that moment, a middle-aged woman entered the frame. She also lived in the Visser building. She looked around for a moment, then stared directly into the camera and warned Dan, "Stay out of that." Suddenly, her hand reached through the screen and grabbed Dan by the throat. He panicked and woke up gasping for air. The next morning, Dan went down to the basement again. He wanted to break into the data storage room, but no matter what he tried, he couldn't get the door open. Frustrated, he went outside and called Mark. Mark seemed busy, so Dan left a voicemail asking him to find a hacker who could crack an electronic lock. After hanging up, he was about to head back when, out of nowhere, Melody appeared. In just a blink, she was standing right in front of him. Dan, stunned, asked how she had gotten there. Melody replied that she didn't know either. As Dan reached out his hand to touch her, a voice suddenly called out from behind. Dan turned and saw Bobby, and the sky had abruptly turned dark. Dan couldn't believe his eyes and kept looking around in disbelief. Then he quickly went inside and completed his work for the day. The footage showed Melody and Annabelle entering Voss's room. Her place looked like an art gallery filled with rare and expensive artworks. Annabelle was mesmerized by Voss's wealth, unaware that all of these were spiritual artifacts. Voss and her former partner, a woman, had both been artists. Later on, they ventured into the field of spiritual research. That was how Voss was able to interfere in the space between Dan and Melody. Melody spotted the box containing the statue that the mysterious group had used during the ritual the other day. She wanted to examine it, but Voss said she didn't have the key. Strangely, Melody and Annabelle made no effort to hide the fact that they knew about the strange cult in the building. After checking the tape's stability, Dan went to sleep. In his dream, he saw his sister. She told him that ghosts were just lost souls, and that he shouldn't be afraid. Just as she finished speaking, Dan suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. He walked down a hallway and entered a room. Inside was Melody. Dan desperately wanted to know how she had come to be here, but Melody didn't know how to answer either. They decided to forget about everything for a moment and just talk like two old friends. After a while, Dan asked Melody about Tuner. She thought she had misheard, so she asked again to be sure. Just at that moment, a light bulb shattered, but when Dan turned the lights on, there was nothing there. He picked up the notebook Melody had been reading and discovered discovered many other similar ones on the shelf next to it, possibly written by someone who had worked there before. From them, Dan found the code to unlock the records room. He immediately ran down and retrieved information about his father. For some reason, a doctor, like Turner, had written about supernatural phenomena. Dan wondered if that was the reason the hospital had suspended him before his death. He also asked Mark to look up the name Bellows, person who had authored the documents he found. After that, Dan went back to work with his equipment. The tape played back a scene of Melody visiting the Voss residence for a dinner party. Thanks to Jess, a few people had agreed to do interviews. At first, the conversations were cheerful and friendly, but when the recent ceremony they had attended was brought up, everyone's expressions changed. They dodged the question and left soon after. Later, when the food was served, the group sat down to eat. Today, Evie, a fairly well-known actress, was also in attendance. Her presence made the atmosphere livelier than usual. However, during a conversation, Tamara accidentally mentioned the death of Evie's father. This deeply upset her. There were rumors that he had taken his own life, but Evie didn't believe that. Seeing her grief, Voss asked Beatrice to perform a seance. Evie didn't seem to believe it at first, but because she wanted to see her father again, she agreed. After some time chanting the incantation, a spirit eventually possessed Evie. The spirit answered with incredible accuracy, sharing details that only Evie and her father could have known. But as the two spoke, the spirit suddenly shouted for her to stay away, startling everyone. Then, the spirit left, and Beatrice was unable to keep it from going. As Melody was about to leave, Voss told her to try calling out to Julia, just in case she had already passed away. Melody thought it made sense, so she agreed to try. Beatrice began the incantation again, but there was no reaction. Just as she thought the ritual had failed, someone else suddenly jumped in. Beatrice was unable to stop it. In the real world, Dan was startled when Melody suddenly appeared behind him. She noticed her journal and necklace at Dan's place and was clearly confused. She asked him what was going on. Dan paused for a moment, remembered what his sister had once said, and told Melody that she was dead and that he was helping her in the way she needed. Upon hearing this, Melody let out a loud scream. All the electrical devices in the house shut off again. When they came back on, Melody had vanished. In Melody's footage, Beatrice began recounting the entire conversation between Melody and Dan. Melody, completely bewildered, asked how Beatrice could possibly know what she had dreamed and who she had met. Beatrice suddenly screamed, "Stop!" then began scratching her own face with her hands, dragging down deep claw marks. She kept doing it until her face was covered in blood, and people had to hold her back. Melody tried to ask her more questions, but Beatrice had already passed out. It wasn't until the next morning that Beatrice was able to speak again. She grabbed Melody's hand tightly and repeated, "Don't let it out." Seeing this, Melody was terrified and ran to look Tuner, but the hospital informed her that he had resigned. Without hesitation, Melody rushed to his house and told him everything she had experienced. Tuner thought she was joking. He explained that the hospital had suspended him for posting a client's case online. He believed the anonymous letter that got him reported had been sent by Melody, but that wasn't true. Melody completely trusted Tuner. He then revealed that he had met a researcher who was searching for a subject showing symptoms similar to Melody's. At first, Tuner thought it might be her, but after a face-to-face meeting, it turned out it wasn't. He advised Melody not to be too scared, suggesting it might just be a psychological phenomenon. Melody disagreed, saying, "How can this be psychological?" She said she would send him the video recording of the seance. That night, Melody returned home and re-watched the footage from the day before. Everything seemed normal, until suddenly, the video began to glitch and flicker. Melody walked closer and looked at the screen. Within the unstable black and white specks, she saw a face staring back at her. Startled, she backed away and immediately sent the tape to Tuner. She couldn't find Annabelle, so she went to ask Jess. The girl said the last time she saw Annabelle was in Voss's room. That's why Melody went up to look for Voss. While she anxiously searched for her friend, Voss accused Melody of suppressing Annabelle, just like her family had done to her former lesbian lover. Melody didn't care about this and firmly asked where Annabelle was. Voss finally said she had lent Annabelle an apartment on the 6th floor to work on her art. Melody went up there and told her friend they had to leave. There was something strange about the building that made her feel unsafe, but Annabelle seemed brainwashed now. She only wanted to stay and told Melody to leave instead. Melody tried to convince her, but it didn't work. As she was about to go back downstairs, Melody was drawn to a door that had been locked from the outside. For some reason, she slowly stepped forward, unlatched the lock, and went in. To her surprise, one of the apartments in this modern building looked completely abandoned. It was damp, covered in ink stains and old. Melody walked inside and encountered a group of strange people. They were singing a creepy song, the same one she had heard before in the community room. When she approached, the group of people suddenly turned to look at her. Melody was about to leave when one of them rushed over and asked if she was from Father Russo's church, begging her to help them. Just then, John entered entered and told the young man to back off. The man, clearly afraid of John, quickly stepped away. Melody was puzzled as to why those people were being locked up. John explained that it was because Samuel was saving them. Everyone inside was an addict. Samuel himself had once been addicted and eventually died, so John didn't want anyone else to suffer the same fate. In the end, John had rented the entire 6th floor for these addicts. Hearing this, Melody didn't ask any further questions. She went home to pack her things, ready to leave this place. But just at that moment, the young man appeared again and said he could help Melody find her mother. In return, she would have to help him escape from there. Melody wondered why he couldn't just leave on his own if he could move freely. He told her it was because Samuel had given them stardust, a kind of addictive mushroom. Besides, unless someone had a special ticket, neither he nor anyone else could leave. That man always found them. Melody didn't fully understand what he meant, but she still followed his instructions. She went to the church to find Father Russo and helped the young man get what he wanted first. However, when she arrived, Melody was shocked to hear that Russo had died in an accident. Left with no choice, Melody began searching for the ticket the young man had mentioned. It wasn't there, but she found something even more surprising. The statue that Samuel's group worshipped was Keelago. This entity was considered both a god and a demon. Samuel's group was called Bondin. Even more bizarre was that he seemed to have multiple identities, but the most remarkable detail was the pattern engraved on the seal of the group. It looked exactly like the ring Julia had left for Melody. Could it be that she was also a member of this strange cult? While Melody was still watching, someone tried to come in. She quickly hid. The ones who entered were Samuel and the church caretaker. Samuel said that Russo had borrowed a valuable book from him and he had come to take it back, but in reality, Samuel was searching for a confidential document that Russo had been keeping. He hadn't found it yet when the caretaker came back in and rushed him, leaving Samuel no choice but to leave. After uncovering this story, Melody immediately called Tuner. She told him that the person he was supposed to meet regarding her condition actually belonged to the Bondin group, and she warned him to be careful. Next, she went to Annabelle's art exhibition. Melody warned her friend that the place wasn't safe and she needed to leave immediately. However, Annabelle didn't care and was too immersed in the joy of realizing her dream. Melody spotted Samuel at the party, but decided to ignore him for now and avoid confrontation. But then something unexpected happened. Someone wanted to buy Annabelle's painting. She refused and wanted to take all her artworks down, ending the exhibition. Melody didn't want Annabelle to ruin her own future, but suddenly, Annabelle shoved her to the ground and even screamed in her face. Melody believed Samuel was the one behind everything, which upset Annabelle. She went to confront him and demand the truth. While the two were arguing, someone suddenly fell from above and died instantly upon impact. In the footage, Dan saw that Virgil was there. Furious, he yelled into the camera, demanding that Virgil come find him immediately. Virgil rushed over and began explaining everything. Dan questioned why. If Virgil already knew everything, he still wanted Dan to restore the tapes. What was the real reason? Virgil revealed that Samuel was his younger brother. He said Samuel was talented but had gone down the wrong path. Samuel worshipped something and managed to gather a group of easily influenced people. Melody had a strong disagreement with him, so Virgil believed she had started the fire that killed Samuel along with the members of the cult. Dan laughed in disbelief, telling Virgil there was no way she could have done that. Virgil responded by asking whether Dan didn't want to know why his house had burned down. Was it really possible that Turner had lost his mind and set the place on fire? As everyone assumed, Dan truly had doubts about what had happened in the past, and that's why he kept going with his work. The next morning, Mark came straight to Dan's office, worried that his friend was losing his mind. But Dan was completely clear-headed. Mark said he had found someone named Bellows. Apparently, Virgil had once hired him to encrypt a set of Japanese action film reels, though it was unclear whether the job had ever been finished. But Bellows had been found dead in an accident, and it was believed that he hadn't been in a stable mental state. Hearing this, Mark realized that not just the Visser building, but this whole place was far from normal. Dan smashed all the surveillance cameras, then returned to restoring the tapes. In one of the recordings, police officers came to question Melody about previous day. The person who had died was Zed, a young man who had once sought Melody's help. She told the police that Zed might not have taken his own life, but had instead been harmed, possibly by someone, or even by Samuel. The officers, confused, asked Melody if she was also on drugs. They didn't believe her, and there was nothing more she could say. Just then, the hospital called to inform her that Annabelle was mentally unstable. She punched out a nurse's teeth and even stabbed another in the eye by a nail. This behavior was completely out of character for Annabelle. She had never acted like this before. Melody remembered the stardust the young addict had once mentioned. and the bottle of ink Voss had given Annabelle for painting, she knew now that they had to be related to what was happening. Determined, Melody went to Voss's house and demanded she reveal where the stardust had come from. Jess was there and became frightened when she saw Melody angry. Melody wanted to take Jess with her, feeling that the place wasn't safe, but the girl said she was forbidden from meeting Melody. It turned out Samuel was the one behind it, afraid that his cult would be exposed. Still, Jess told Melody that the stardust was kept in the basement. Melody immediately went down there. As soon as she opened the door, she saw a layer of glittering mold. That's why they called it stardust. Melody was filming the scene in there. All of a sudden, Samuel appeared. At that moment, the tape became damaged. Dan took it out of the projector to check and discovered that the reel was covered in the same kind of mold found at the Visser building. He opened the projector and saw that it had also been completely overtaken by mold. Dan called Virgil to ask about it, but Virgil had no idea what was going on. With no other option, Dan went inside to look for a backup projector. There, he found Bellows's camera. At first, the footage seemed normal, but as Dan watched more, he uncovered increasingly strange things about the house. Virgil's company had originally started as a genetic research firm, but that was just a cover. It seemed like Virgil had been searching for someone. Even more disturbing, the fridge was full of stored blood. Dan had no idea what they intended to do with it. Most surprising of all, the film Bellows had been hired to digitize turned out to be an ongoing series about Pachika, a resident of the Visser building. Bellows had also seen something in the footage watching him. Just like Dan had, Bellows eventually lost his mind and tried to destroy everything, but the video ended there. Dan continued restoring the final tape. By this point, Samuel had appeared again, but he didn't harm Melody. He simply explained that the stardust was his way of expressing faith in the divine. Samuel then led Melody deeper beneath the basement, into what seemed like a ceremonial hall used by the cult. It was there that he finally revealed everything. In truth, Melody's mother had never lived in the building. Every clue that had led Melody there had been orchestrated by Samuel. To the cult, Melody was someone very special, and they needed her. Samuel showed Melody something even more horrifying. The people in the cult had once performed human sacrifices for their god, for some unknown purpose. However, they had failed. Melody sarcastically asked Samuel if he had brought her there just to slit her throat like in the video, but he said no, they already had a volunteer. Melody couldn't take it anymore. She was done with these lunatics, so she rushed back to her room to pack her things, but then she suddenly remembered what Samuel had said about the volunteer. She realized it was Jess. She hurried to Jess's house to get her out, but they had gotten there first. Melody tried to head to the 6th floor to check, but John appeared and blocked her way. Samuel wanted a private place to talk, hoping to convince Melody to join the cult. But of course, Melody wasn't crazy. There was no way she would agree. Just as Melody was about to leave, for some unknown reason, Turner suddenly showed up. He brought 2 others with him, and they grabbed Melody, ignoring her desperate struggle. At that moment, Melody looked directly into the camera, desperately pleading for help, as if trying to send a signal to Dan. Dan noticed something strange and quickly paused the tape. Suddenly, the screen became unstable, and a face appeared, staring straight at him. It tried to crawl out of the screen and lunge at Dan, but he was quicker and smashed the monitor to pieces. Dan stormed into the records room and began destroying everything bizarre he could find. In the process, he accidentally broke through the wall behind. Inside, it was completely filled with stardust. He pushed aside the tape shelf and discovered a hidden door beneath it. Dan opened the door and slowly descended. When he saw the room in full view, he realized it was the cult's sacrificial chamber. As he was looking around, someone suddenly came up from behind and knocked him unconscious. When Dan woke up, he wasn't sure if what had just happened was a dream or reality, but something terrified him. His mouth was full of mold. He tried to throw it all up and then woke up again for real. It turned out that the earlier scene had only been a dream. Dan looked around, confused, realizing he was at home. He went to Virgil's office, desperate to know why he had ended up back at his house. Virgil explained that Dan had collapsed from overworking, and they had taken him to the hospital. The doctors wanted to keep him for observation, but Virgil thought going home would help him recover faster. Dan, angry, accused Virgil of lying and said he only wanted to find his younger brother so the ritual could continue. Hearing that, Virgil also shouted, telling Dan to shut up and not to think they didn't know he had destroyed equipment in the research facility. He warned Dan to act like nothing happened if he didn't want to end up in jail. With that, Dan had no choice but to back down and return home. But the moment he walked through the door, he sensed something was wrong, like someone was breaking into his house. As he got closer, he realized it was Mark. Seeing Dan safe and sound, Mark was overjoyed and rushed over to hug him. Dan then showed Mark the video of Bellows losing control and smashing things. Dan explained that Bellows had seen something in the screen, and so had he. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, but it wasn't. People believed that cameras or video equipment could capture things the human eye couldn't see. Mark, looking skeptical, said he didn't think Dan had been chosen by some stone god or whatever. Then he brought Dan to a room full of files and images. It was all the data Mark had found on a mysterious group called VOS. The group had been founded by 3 people, Isaac, Jonah, and Lucas. They were involved in horrific things like human sacrifice and dark magic. Mark showed Dan a picture of a woman who closely resembled the one Annabelle had painted, but even more disturbing was the presence of a strange entity found among the materials. The entity was very blurry, so Dan wasn't sure if it was the same thing he had seen. Mark had also found a reel of film showing the cult performing a sacrificial ritual. Back in 1924, VOS recruited a new maid after the previous one had suddenly left. That was also when she discovered the statue of Keelago. That very night, she held a gathering with her followers. Together with several others, she began the ritual to summon Keelago. Jonah stood nearby, continuously taking photos of VOS. Purpose of this was to confirm whether the god they worship would respond to the summoning. When Jonah and VOS developed the photographs, they fatally saw it. This was why the official sacrifice ritual took place a few days later. The night before the ritual, someone tried to steal the prayer book. She belonged to the Bondin Coven, which was completely different from VOS's cult. The Bondin witches had once summoned Keelago too, believing it to be a god who would bring peace and prosperity to humanity. But they were wrong. Keelago was actually a force of destruction for mankind. The surviving members of Bondin had always worked to prevent its return to the world. Now this woman was trying to do the same, but Jonah shot her dead. They used her blood to prepare for the ritual. The day of the sacrifice coincided with the appearance of a rare constellation. That night, most members of the cult attended, except for Lucas, who walked away. He knew this was madness, not peace. Humanity had to solve its own problems and shouldn't rely on anything else. But VOS refused to see reason and still went ahead with the ritual. She led the maid down into the basement of the house, where several people were already waiting. She began reciting the incantation and poured the blood of the Bondin witch. Then she continued chanting. Suddenly, everyone put on masks. The maid, confused and unaware of what was happening, watched as VOS made a cut across her neck. As she collapsed, a glowing circle appeared. At that point, the movie ended. Mark and Dan had no idea what was going on. Mark urged Dan to stop investigating, that this cursed story should end here, but Dan refused. He needed to find out whether his father had any connection to it. So the two of them went to find Annabelle. When Annabelle saw Dan, she wasn't surprised. It was as if she had been waiting for him for a very long time. Or more precisely, it was Melody who had been waiting for him for a long time. Melody had been taken to the other side. The day Turner came to take her away, it had actually been to protect her. He had discovered something strange about Samuel, so he claimed Melody was mentally ill to justify bringing her somewhere safer. However, Melody was determined to rescue Jess. No matter how much Turner tried to persuade her, she insisted on returning to the Visser building. Seeing that, Turner brought her to meet Annabelle and then locked her up. Annabelle revealed that today was the day the rare constellation would appear. The cult would carry out the sacrificial ritual to open the gate between the two worlds. Melody immediately climbed out the window to return to the Visser building. At that point, Annabelle didn't know anything more. Jess was still alive and was now a nun at a church. She had left behind several tapes for Dan. Dan and Mark returned home and played them, and saw footage of Melody going back to the building. She climbed up to the 6th floor and entered through the window into the room where Jess was being held. The girl believed she had a mission to save the world, but Melody didn't hesitate to tell her the truth. They were planning to slit her throat and drain all the blood from her body. She told Jess she had to leave immediately. Hearing that, Jess finally became afraid. She climbed out the window to escape. Just then, someone approached from outside. With no other choice, Melody stayed behind to buy Jess some time. John entered, saw that Jess was gone, and knocked Melody unconscious. When she woke up, she was in the cult's sacrificial hall, along with the other members of VOS. Melody thought that without Jess, the ritual couldn't happen, but she was wrong. The one who absolutely had to be there was her. She had the bloodline of the Bondin witches. Without Melody, the ritual simply couldn't proceed. As for the vessel meant for Keelago, if one person failed, another could take their place. The ceremony continued just like that. Melody's blood dripped onto the demon statue, and Samuel decisively slit the throat of a living person. As soon as he finished chanting the incantation, that glowing circle appeared again, with VOS standing inside it. The light slowly expanded, reaching Samuel and Melody. Meanwhile, from a corner, Jess, trembling in fear, had recorded the entire scene. Melody screamed at her to leave immediately. Realizing she could do nothing, Jess ran away. For some unknown reason, the Visser building later caught fire. After finally understanding everything, Dan went to find Virgil. He showed him the last remaining tape salvaged from the Visser building. From the very beginning, Virgil had known a little about this ritual because Samuel had told him, but at the time, he didn't believe it. Only after his younger younger brother went missing, did he start searching. The person who had kept this tape was Dan's father. He had stored it in the archives. Virgil realized that the Turner family's house had been burned down precisely because they possessed this tape. The culprits were the group trying to prevent Keeligow's return. Dan wanted to save Melody. After all, he had spent so much time investigating this case. Virgil had nearly all the necessary conditions to reopen the gate to the other world, but he refused, even though it could save his own younger brother. Enraged, Dan lunged at him, but Virgil suddenly pulled out a gun and aimed it at him. Just as he was about to pull the trigger and send Dan to the other side, Mark struck from behind, knocking Virgil unconscious. Mark urged them to leave immediately. Once Virgil woke up, he would kill them both, but Dan refused. He was determined to save Melody, no matter what. Mark really wanted to leave, but he couldn't abandon his friend, so he reluctantly followed Dan. Dan led him deep into the research facility, where they were preparing to perform the ritual to open the gateway. Suddenly, Bobby appeared, pressing a gun against Mark's head. She demanded that you two want to summon a demon, she demanded. Dan quickly raised his hands in surrender, explaining that he only wanted to save someone. Bobby was puzzled. Why would Dan risk everything for someone he'd only met in dreams? Then, another shocking secret was revealed. Bobby was actually Julia, Melody's mother. She knew that those born with the Bondon witch's bloodline were destined for tragedy, which was why she had given Melody away as a child. But unexpectedly, Melody went searching for her mother and ended up trapped in this nightmare. Julia desperately wanted to save her daughter, but her own magic had faded long ago. That's why she had manipulated Virgil into retrieving the ritual tapes. However, reopening the gateway would weaken the barrier between worlds, something Dan had already experienced when he was nearly dragged into the other side by the demon. Now, everything was ready. Julia could open the portal for Dan to cross over, but he had only 5 minutes to find Melody and return. If he failed, the demon would keep him there forever. Dan understood and stepped through the portal. He appeared at the research facility, and right behind him was his sister. In this world, there had never been a fire, and his whole family was living together as normal. As much as Dan longed for that feeling of family reunion, he chose to leave and searched for Melody. He ran everywhere and finally found her at a church. The demon had deceived Melody into staying there, promising that Julia would come. Dan explained everything and led her away. However, the space around them began to distort. While Dan was trying to find a way back, Melody was drawn to something. She walked up to an air vent and pulled it down. Immediately, Keeligow appeared behind her. Dan heard her scream and rushed over to pull her away. The two of them ran without knowing where they were headed. When they reached the ground floor of the Visser building, Samuel suddenly appeared, pushed Dan aside, and dragged Melody into the portal. Melody sat up and found herself back, but Dan was nowhere to be seen. When he woke up, Dan realized he was lying in a hospital. He had become the victims of the Visser building fire. He didn't understand what had happened. Perhaps he had fallen into a chaotic rift of space and time in that world. The nurse told him he had been asleep for quite a long time and needed more rest to recover. The movie ended here. Thank you all for your interest and for watching. Goodbye, and see you again.